My name is Boris. I work for Fraunhofer, and in my role, I'm a member of the board of directors of the IDS Association and also of the Gaia X Association. So two endeavors which aim at defining and rolling out a software infrastructure that we can use to build data spaces up upon. As I said, so that's a nice fit, and also in that role, I'm also involved in the German Datenraummobilität, so the mobility data space initiative in Germany, and that's what I wanted to report a little bit about. How, let's say, data spaces, what role data spaces play in the new ecosystems that we want to achieve, and also what that means for mobility. Let me introduce the topic by defining a couple of these buzzwords that we keep hearing about, like ecosystems, data spaces, and data sharing, and soft infrastructure. Because while sometimes you get the feeling that people use them synonymously, that is definitely not true. But we should rather think of them in a consistent end-to-end architectural stack. And that is the one that I'd like to introduce to you. So on the top layer, we see here a mobility ecosystem where multiple actors are member of. And all of those guys are somehow involved in all the cool new services that we are aiming at, like end-to-end intermodal mobility services, which I would also like to use more frequently, of course, which take me from A, where I sit here, to Z, where I want to go, and orchestrate all the navigation, the payment stuff, the location issues for me from by one-stop shopping, let's call it like that. So these kind of data-driven services are what makes ecosystem interesting and where innovation happens, right? So what we also see in ecosystems is that, as mentioned, there are many different members involved. And no single one of them has all the data that is needed in order to offer these kind of end-to-end service. As in the case of intermodal mobility services, we can easily imagine that there are different means of transportation involved, like the public transport, the railway carrier, then perhaps also an airline or a car sharing agency. And all of these offerings needs to be aligned according to my individual navigation scheme and my destination, right? And therefore, these guys need to have a virtual data space in place. You can see here, this is the second layer, so the data space layer, where a shared digital twin of parts of myself, so payment information, where do I want to go, what are my mobility preferences, stuff like that, but also timetables, congestion on roads, perhaps accidents on railway tracks and stuff like that is basically put together, but in a way where the data is not dumped in one central store where one single player sits upon, because that's what we do not want. We do not want to have these centers of data gravity, let's call it like that, but in a distributed fashion, right? So it should be a distributed software infrastructure that allows us to build these data spaces. Talking about this software infrastructure brings us to the lowest layer of this architecture. As mentioned, we need to have software components in place, which allows us to basically retrieve the data, attach usage information to the data, so the terms and conditions for the data economy, which, for example, say, okay, you are allowed to use my data until a certain time, point in time has arrived, or you can use my data 3 times and not more often. You can, you are allowed to forward my data. You are not allowed to forward my data. You are allowed to forward my data only if you pay me a certain fee, for example. Things like that. Things that we are totally familiar with in the physical world, that is something that we also need to have in the digital, in the data world. And what we need to build up are these kind of, let's say, architectural stacks that makes that happen. And we can see here that on the upper part, that is where the magic happens, where the innovation happens, where the new cool and startup-driven business models take place. But we also see that probably somebody in the middle needs to take care of organizing these data spaces, and then also needs to be somebody in place who runs the software infrastructure. And that brings me to a discussion that we are just having in Gaia-X. So Gaia-X is a European, a true European endeavor with, I believe, almost 300 members already, aiming at specifying a software infrastructure for data spaces in Europe and also implementing the relevant components in open source. And what we see is that these data spaces emerge. So they are not just happen like that with a flip of the finger, but they basically evolve, right? So usually certain closed ecosystems start, and then we are ending up in the second phase where we have open ecosystems. And this is, by the way, something that we just are implementing in the mobility data space in Germany. So it's there. First use cases have already been put live. So, and they are there, they are operational, and we are now continuously extending the number and the range of use cases so that we can show even more by the ITS World Congress in September. However, talking about European data spaces, what of course we see is that we have a data space for mobility in Germany, but there are other endeavors. For example, it's called travel data space in France, which is also emerging. And so we will very quickly see different actors, members, companies in these data spaces, which belong to more than one, right? So what we need to make sure is that these orange dots here, these federators that basically make interoperability, sovereignty, and trust happen, that these are as well interoperable, so that they basically form a federation of ecosystems, if you may. I can virtually see how you think, oh, what is this guy talking about? Is that already around the corner, or is that far ahead? Well, no, it's actually happening. Because as mentioned in the mobility data space, this orange dot here is formed by a non-for-profit limited company called Datenraum Mobilität GmbH. And similar things will happen very soon, as I said, in France, in Netherlands, in Finland, and so on. And these federators, these, let's say, carrier organizations for the data spaces need to rely on the same infrastructure. That is important because in Europe, as you know, in the European data strategy, there is the demand, the call for the establishment of, I believe, 9 domain-specific data spaces, but there will not be the one mobility data space, right? There will be many endeavors, many initiatives on national or regional level, which then all together form virtually a European mobility data space. And that can be achieved when we make sure that all of these data space endeavors use the same software infrastructure standards. That's very important. So talking about data spaces and data sharing service providers, we know what businesses need, and that was also mentioned by Alberto, by the way. So we want to make use of the data because there is where innovation happens. We also want to have, let's say, low transaction costs. So I want to have easy access to a data space. So if I'm a startup, I don't want to, want to invest time, large amounts of money for integrating stuff. It must be easy, like we know it from the consumer world. But that also means that I, as a data provider, want to have ease of use in terms of making my data available in a self-controlled data sovereign fashion. And of course, we want to have fair data sharing. So we want to have no login, like we know that also from the consumer arm. We don't want to have data monopolies, these, as I mentioned, centers of data gravity. Also, we want to see no gatekeeping, right? Which basically puts then up a paywall for certain things. And it should be open for engaging, but open also in the design and development process. This is also why in Gaia-X and IDS, we strongly support open source as a key strategic endeavor. And we want to have and must assure data sovereignty. So the data provider, the interests of the data provider must be acknowledged and protected. He or she should be in control about what's happening to their data. And what we want to do is providing these data providers with a technical instrument, with technical means to do that by software. Then we also, and I don't want to go into the details of that, We need to also look into, okay, what's the business model of these intermediaries, which make sure that, let's say, a data catalog is there where everybody can look up, okay, this data is available under which condition, where data transactions are logged in order to see, okay, look, the business partner I'm doing business with has received my data along with the usage conditions which I attached him to adhere to, and I have a proof point, so we need logging for that. Also, we need to take care of shared vocabularies in order to make sure that computer systems can understand each other. And these things need to be organized by federators. And I'd like to draw to your attention that the European Commission has well, not so recently yet, like 6 months ago, issued the so-called Data Governance Act, which basically defines provisions for the business models of these federators or intermediaries, as we call them here, in order to make sure that, let's say, no data concentration takes place as we know it from, as I said, the consumer world. So what does that mean for the mobility domain? As mentioned, in my point of view, the mobility domain could really spearhead this endeavor, should be really leading these kind of developments, what is actually, as I said, happening already. But what makes me confident, or let's say look forward to the future developments? Well, first, I think there is a variety of, let's say, mature semantic information system standards like DATEX II, which was mentioned, of course, and well, this is what our conference is about. So it's there, we can use that. This is the starting point, which is very good. We have a network of national access points, which already function as a neutral, let's say, a retail store for certain public transport data, which is a good thing. So we can leverage that. So we do not start on a blank sheet of paper. There are, as mentioned, strong initiatives already set up or on the way in the member stage, like the mobility data space in Germany, the travel data space in France, but there are for sure way more out there. And of course, what is also great in the mobility domain is that it brings by nature all the relevant stakeholders together. So we basically end up in many cases like in a B2B to C to G scenario, because if I refer to this intermodal mobility service, it's clear that I need to have the private sector on board, public sector, so local municipalities, but also, let's say, national data providers like weather services, traffic management agencies, things like that. So here everything comes together, right? And of course, and that is also the good sign, there are already ongoing projects to basically, as mentioned, implement the standards that are currently well, emerging and waiting to be proliferated and adopted. So that is something we have already started. So, and that is also with what I want to conclude my little talk with, to invite everybody to embark to this journey and support us in the endeavor to make, well, the Federation of European Data Spaces happen, in particular, and as I said, spearheaded by the mobility domain. Thank you very much.